remember in the very early days, in the 1960s and in the 1970s, the grand project as conceived by Kwame Nkrumah having failed to take off as it was designed to take off, many African countries took the view that the only way in which we could ultimately have the grand African agenda was to come up with regional developments. So we came up with the East African Community, and indeed, I can remember so very vividly, because even in Africa, there were days when Africa worked in the early days. In the early days, many African countries were recording economic growth of anything between 6 and 7%. In the early days after independence, there were areas where Africa was growing in education. In the health, the indices had improved so that infant mortality and maternal mortality indices were positive. We could see that in agriculture, Africa was beginning to feed herself. Africa was adding value to her things. I remember in Nairobi, in public schools, young school children would receive textbooks and exercise books. There are those who think that it was externally induced. They may be right. There are those who think that our leadership was also a contributory factor, and I think they are right. So that there is a sense in which we Africans are also co-authors of our own misfortune. We are co-authors in the sense that there is, and there have been opportunities to make us great. Go to the Democratic Republic of Congo, a paradox and an irony at once, the richest country on earth in terms of natural resources. But who will allow Congo to be at ease? Who will allow her? Because in her state of confusion, she is a jungle from which you can hunt without consequence. So when one rebel group dies, another one is resuscitated. I know of no African country that makes weapons except South Africa. The others just make bullets. The Kenyans will make bullets. The Ugandans will make bullets, but they have no gun to use them, and they import the guns. And yet the conflicts that are alive and well in Africa are legion. As the Central African Republic, there are conflicts which are no longer covered in the newspapers or in the media of the forgotten conflicts of Africa. Burkina Faso. And yet the African Union says that by the year 2020, the guns will be silent in Africa. 2020 is 28 days away from today. The guns will not be silent. African community was there. South African development community was there. We had COMESA, we had IGAD, we have ECOWAS, we had Central African Organization, we had the Maghreb, we had the Sahelians. All these attempts have been made, and somehow Africa is still punching below her weight. There are certain things that Africa must do, and there are certain things that Africa must not do. The belief that we can borrow money from multilateral institutions and become rich is misguided. Zambia's Dambisa Moyo in a book, Dead Aid, tells us it cannot be done. That is the route not to take. The belief that we will follow a model that is conceived on our behalf by European universities is misguided. I want you to read the book written by a Korean called Ha Jun Chang, The Bad Samaritans, in which he argues that each country must find a model that suits our own circumstances. It can't be done. I want also to remember a book which all of you must have read, written by my own Kenyan friend, Dr. Kalestas Juma, The New Harvest, in which he says that Africans must invent and innovate. I want you to read a book written by Olusegun Obasanjo and Greg Mills, among others, Making Africa Work. Africa can be made to work. But Africa will only be made to work when she is conscious of her current position. Which brings me to a question that we must now pose. What is the danger of other powers operating in Africa? Do they threaten our being? And I'm now talking about China. China is a very interesting country from which there is a lot of things to learn. But she's also a danger to the continent if we are not careful. What is there to learn from China? The thing to learn from China is that during our lifetime, the Chinese, through their ingenuity, have succeeded in lifting nearly 800 million people out of poverty. What did the Chinese do? Is there something that we can learn from them? I think there is. Those of you who have the advantage and the privilege of serving in government, ask yourself, what did the Chinese do that within our own lifetime they succeeded in doing that? And they are everywhere, the Chinese. They know what they want. I think the first thing that you must do, you must know what you want. You know, last year I was sitting and watching a Chinese news channel, and if you want to understand what others who are potentially your friends and enemies are doing, you must listen to their news. I was watching the CGTN, and I was listening to the 6,000 delegates in China sitting and thinking about China, how China will deal with Africa and the world 100 years from thence. The people who are there will not be alive. In many African countries, if you tell them to think about what will happen tomorrow, they say only God knows. No. I hold the view that when you are planning, you plan as if you will never die. And if you are prayerful, you pray as if you'll die the next minute. I'm suggesting that the Chinese have given us away. Today, the Chinese, and see how the Chinese are working with us. Which university in Africa worth its name does not have a Confucius Center? I do not know whether you have one here at UCC. Chinese have a Confucius Center because the mind is the standard of the man. Once you influence the mind, you can sit pretty because you can predict what the man will do. How many of you who are the middle class today, in addition to asking your children to read French and German, are now asking and encouraging their children, go ye and learn Mandarin? How many of you? Confucius Center to work on your mind. On our mind. And then, how many countries in Africa don't you find a stadium built by Chinese? And if it is not a stadium, it is your state house. And if it is not the state house, it's the African headquarters. And if it is not the African headquarters, it's infrastructure, is the road or the railway. And if it is not the railway, it is 4 lorries. And if it is not those, in the next 10 years, out of every 10 phones used by you will be Chinese. If it is not Techno, it is Infinix. If it is not Infinix, it is Huawei. No African country produces a phone. None. It's only Rwanda that is beginning to assemble some. There is something to admire about the Chinese. But if we want to benefit from the Chinese, we must be strong. We must be weak. We must not be weak. We must negotiate continentally. The Koreans are also small but strong. But if we are not careful, and I'm saying this, if we are not careful, in the next 25 years, all of us will be speaking Mandarin.